The fluorescent lights of the Walter Reed Military Medical Center hummed with their characteristic buzz, casting their sterile glow across the polished linoleum floors. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of grey November day that seemed to seep cold through the very walls of the building. The waiting room was filled with the usual mix of patients, family members, and staff moving purposefully through the corridors. In the corner of the waiting area, seated in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed to make waiting even more unbearable, sat an elderly man. His name was Harold Mitchell, though everyone who knew him called him Harry. At 87 years old, Harry had the kind of face that told stories without saying a word. Deep lines carved into weathered skin spoke of decades of sun, wind, and experiences that most people couldn't even imagine. Harry was wearing his old army jacket, the one he'd kept all these years. It was faded now, the olive drab having softened to something closer to sage green over the decades. But the patches were still there, carefully maintained. The 101st Airborne Division insignia, the Combat Infantryman badge, and most notably, the small, unassuming patch that marked him as a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Most people walking by wouldn't notice it. Most people didn't know what they were looking at. To them, Harry was just another old man in a worn jacket, sitting alone in a hospital waiting room. His hands, gnarled with arthritis and age, trembled slightly as they rested on his lap. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, watched the comings and goings with the patient observation of someone who had learned long ago that watching carefully could save your life. Harry had been waiting for 2 hours already. His appointment had been scheduled for 9 in the morning. It was now past 11. He hadn't complained, not once. He never did. That wasn't his way. He had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in places that now existed only in history books and the fading memories of the few who had been there. His wife Margaret had passed away 3 years ago, 62 years of marriage, and now he was alone. Their children lived across the country, busy with their own lives and families. They called when they could, visited when they could, but Harry understood. Life moves on. It's supposed to. He didn't begrudge them their happiness, their busy schedules. He just wished, sometimes, that he didn't feel quite so invisible. The hospital was crowded that day, some kind of administrative backup, they had said. Staff shortages, computer problems, the usual excuses. Harry had nodded and returned to his seat, prepared to wait as long as necessary. He had survived worse than waiting. At the nurses' station near the waiting area, a woman named Denise Crawford was having what she would later describe as the worst day of her life, though she had no one to blame but herself. She was 43 years old, recently divorced, drowning in debt and consumed by a bitterness that had been growing inside her for years. Denise had once been different. There had been a time when she had entered nursing because she genuinely wanted to help people. But somewhere along the way, that idealism had been ground down by the relentless machinery of modern healthcare. The endless paperwork, the ungrateful patients, the administrators who cared more about budgets than people, the husband who had left her for a younger woman, the children who barely spoke to her anymore. None of this excused what she was about to do. Nothing could. But understanding the path that led her there helps explain how someone could lose their way so completely. Harry approached the nurse's station slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, and each step came with a small price of pain that he had learned to accept as the cost of continuing to move. He reached the counter and waited politely to be acknowledged. Denise was staring at her computer screen, scrolling through what appeared to be a social media feed. She had seen the old man approach, but hadn't bothered to look up. In her mind, he could wait. Everyone could wait. The whole world could wait for all she cared. "Excuse me," Harry said, his voice quiet but clear. "I was wondering if you might be able to tell me how much longer the wait might be. I've been here since 9. Denise still didn't look up. "Take a seat," she said flatly. "You'll be called when it's your turn." Harry nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I understand," he said. "I was just hoping for an estimate. I need to take my medication at a certain time, and I left it at home because I thought I'd be back by now." This finally got Denise's attention, though not in the way Harry had hoped. She looked up, her eyes cold, her expression one of practiced annoyance. "Well, that was pretty stupid, wasn't it?" she said. "You should always bring your medication with you. That's basic common sense." Harry blinked, taken aback by her tone. "You're right," he said softly. "I made a mistake. I apologize." Something about his quiet acceptance, his gentle apology, seemed to irritate Denise even more. She was looking for a fight, looking for someone to push back against so she could unleash the frustration that had been building inside her for months. His calm response only made her angrier. "Look," she said, her voice rising slightly, "I don't know when they'll call you. Could be an hour, could be 3. These things take time. You military guys think you're entitled to special treatment, walking in here with your little medals and your old uniforms, expecting everyone to drop what they're doing for you." Harry said nothing. His hands, already trembling, seemed to shake a little more. "You want my honest opinion?" Denise continued, leaning forward. "You're not special. Nobody here cares about what you did 50 years ago or whenever. You're just another patient in a long line of patients. And frankly, you're taking up time and resources that could go to people who actually have a future ahead of them." The words hung in the air like poison. Several people in the waiting room had stopped what they were doing. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes were turning toward the nurse's station, drawn by the ugly scene unfolding there. Harry's face had gone pale. Not from anger, though he would have been entitled to it. From hurt. Deep, profound hurt that seemed to reach into the very core of who he was. In that moment, standing at that counter, he wasn't a decorated war hero. He wasn't the man who had single-handedly held a position against an entire German platoon to allow his wounded comrades to escape. He was just an old man being told that his life, his service, his very existence meant nothing. "I'm sorry to have bothered you," Harry said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go sit down." He turned to make his way back to his seat, his shoulders hunched in a way they hadn't been before, as if carrying a new weight that had been added to all the others he bore. And that's when the door at the far end of the waiting room opened. The man who walked through was in his early 50s, though he moved with the easy confidence of someone much younger. He stood about 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, efficient musculature that spoke of a lifetime of physical discipline. His hair was cropped short, grey at the temples, and his eyes had the sharp, assessing quality of someone who was always aware of his surroundings. His name was Commander Michael Sullivan, United States Navy, retired. 22 years of service, most of it with the Navy SEALs. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and a deep, unshakable belief in certain principles that he had carried with him since he was 18 years old and had first raised his hand to swear an oath to his country. Michael had come to the hospital for a routine checkup. Nothing serious. Just the usual maintenance that came with getting older and having put his body through more than most people could imagine. He had been looking forward to a quick in and out, maybe grabbing lunch afterward at the little diner down the street that he liked. But as he walked into the waiting room, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. Years of operating in hostile environments had given him an almost preternatural ability to read a room, to sense tension, to identify threats. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that something bad was happening. His eyes swept the room, taking in the frozen faces of the other patients, the uncomfortable shifting of a few staff members, and finally settling on the scene at the nurses' station. He saw the old man in the faded army jacket, his shoulders slumped, turning away from the counter, and he saw the nurse behind it, her face still twisted in an expression of contempt. Michael had not heard the words that had been spoken. He didn't need to. He could read the situation as clearly as if it had been written in front of him, and then he noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold with a very particular kind of anger. The old man's jacket, the patches, the small, distinctive medal patch that most people wouldn't recognize but that Michael knew instantly. He had stood in the presence of Medal of Honor recipients before. He knew what that patch meant. He knew the kind of courage, the kind of sacrifice, the kind of extraordinary humanity it represented. And he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had just happened, it was not acceptable. Michael's stride changed. It was subtle, nothing that would be obvious to the casual observer, but those who knew him would have recognized it instantly. It was the walk of a man who had made a decision, who had identified an objective, and who was now moving to accomplish it with the same quiet determination he had brought to every mission he had ever undertaken. He reached Harry just as the old man was about to sit down. "Excuse me, sir," Michael said, his voice carrying the crisp, respectful tone of military address. "May I have a word?" Harry looked up, confused. His eyes met Michael's, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of one warrior to another, the unspoken understanding that exists between those who have served. "Of course," Harry said. Michael extended his hand. "Commander Michael Sullivan, Navy, retired. I couldn't help but notice your jacket, sir. That's 101st Airborne, isn't it?" Harry nodded slowly. "It is. I was with them during the war. The big one, I mean. World War II. Michael's eyes went to the Medal of Honor patch. "And that," he said, his voice dropping to something approaching reverence, "that's not something you see every day. May I ask your name, sir?" "Harold Mitchell." "But everyone calls me Harry." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Harold Mitchell. He knew that name. Anyone who had studied military history, who had read the accounts of extraordinary valor that emerged from the Second World War, would know that name. "Sergeant Harold Mitchell," Michael said slowly. "December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. You held a position alone for 7 hours against an entire German platoon so that your wounded squad could be evacuated. You were shot 3 times and still refused to leave until every man was safe." Harry's eyes widened. "You know about that?" "Sir," Michael said with absolute sincerity, "they teach what you did in training. What you accomplished that day is considered one of the most extraordinary acts of individual courage in American military history. It is an honor to meet you." For a moment, Harry couldn't speak. It had been so long since anyone had known, so long since anyone had understood. The isolation of his daily life, the loneliness, the feeling of being forgotten, it all seemed to rush up at once. "Thank you," he managed to say. "That means more than you know." Michael nodded. Then his expression changed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir," he said, "I noticed you were speaking with someone at the nurses' station just now. I didn't hear what was said, but I could tell something was wrong. Would you mind telling me what happened?" Harry hesitated. "It's nothing," he said. "Just a misunderstanding." "With respect, sir," Michael said, "it didn't look like nothing. You looked hurt, and in my experience, men like you don't get hurt easily." There was a long pause. Harry looked at this younger man, this stranger who had recognized him, who had known his story, who was showing him a respect he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. And something in that look, that genuine concern, broke through the walls he had built. She told me I wasn't special, Harry said quietly, that nobody cares what I did, that I'm taking up resources that should go to people with a future ahead of them. Michael was very still. His face remained composed, but something changed in his eyes. Those who knew him well would have recognized it as danger, a cold, controlled fury that was far more frightening than any outburst of temper could ever be. "She said that," Michael said. It wasn't a question. Harry nodded. "Wait here, sir," Michael said. "Please." He turned and walked toward the nurse's station. His stride was measured, unhurried, but there was something in it that made people instinctively move out of his way. The air in the waiting room seemed to grow heavy with anticipation. Denise saw him coming and immediately misread the situation. She saw a well-built man approaching with purpose and assumed he was going to try to flirt with her or ask for special treatment or cause some kind of problem that she would have to deal with. She prepared her standard dismissive attitude. "Can I help you?" she said, her voice carrying the same bored irritation she had shown Harry. Michael stopped at the counter. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, looking at her with those assessing eyes, reading her the way he would read a target, understanding her in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. "I believe you can," he said finally. "My name is Commander Michael Sullivan, United States Navy, retired, and I have some questions about how you treat the patients in this facility." Something in his tone made Denise pause. There was no hostility in it, no raised voice, nothing she could point to as threatening, but there was an authority there, a quiet power, that she hadn't encountered before. "I treat patients just fine," she said, but some of her confidence had evaporated. "Do you?" Michael said, "because I just witnessed something that suggests otherwise. The gentleman who was just here, the elderly man in the army jacket. What did you say to him?" Denise felt her face flush. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Michael's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Several other people in the waiting room were now openly watching, and Denise was acutely aware of their attention. "Look," she said, trying to regain control, "I don't have to explain myself to you. If you have a complaint, you can file it with administration. Now, do you need something, or are you just here to waste my time?" Michael leaned forward slightly. Not close enough to be threatening, but enough to command her full attention. "Let me tell you something about that man you just insulted," he said. "His name is Sergeant Harold Mitchell. In December of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, his squad was ambushed by German forces. Most of his men were wounded. They were cut off, surrounded, with no hope of rescue." Denise opened her mouth to speak, but something in Michael's eyes stopped her. "Sergeant Mitchell," Michael continued, "ordered his men to fall back while he provided covering fire. Alone, armed with only his rifle and a handful of grenades, he held a position against an entire platoon of German soldiers for 7 hours. 7 hours. He was shot 3 times, once in the shoulder, once in the leg, once in the side, and he kept fighting. The waiting room had gone completely silent. Everyone was listening now. When reinforcements finally arrived, Michael said, they found him still at his post, still firing, still protecting the position that had allowed his wounded comrades to escape to safety. Every single one of those men survived because of what Sergeant Mitchell did that day. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, the highest military decoration this country can bestow. Denise's face had gone white. She tried to speak, but couldn't find words. "That man," Michael said, pointing toward where Harry sat watching the scene unfold, "has given more to this country than most people can even imagine. He has bled for it. He has watched his friends die for it. He has carried the weight of that service for 80 years, and you had the audacity to tell him that nobody cares, that he's not special, that he's taking up resources that should go to someone else?" "I didn't know," Denise whispered. Michael shook his head slowly. That's exactly the problem, he said. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. You looked at an old man in a worn jacket, and you saw someone you could dismiss, someone you could talk down to, someone who didn't matter. He paused, letting his words sink in. But here's what you need to understand, he continued, even if he hadn't done any of that, even if he had never won any medals or performed any acts of heroism, even if he was just an ordinary person who had never served a day in his life, he would still deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Every person who walks through those doors deserves that. That's not something people have to earn. It's something they're entitled to simply by virtue of being human. Denise was shaking now. Years of bitterness and anger, all the walls she had built up to protect herself from a world she felt had wronged her, were crumbling under the weight of this quiet, devastating rebuke. "I'm going to ask you a question," Michael said, "and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Is this the person you set out to be? When you became a nurse, when you dedicated yourself to caring for others, is this who you wanted to become?" Tears were forming in Denise's eyes. "No," she whispered. "No, it's not. Then I suggest," Michael said, his voice softening slightly, "that you think about what went wrong. And I suggest you start by going over to that man and apologizing. Not because I'm telling you to, but because it's the right thing to do." He stepped back from the counter. "I'll be speaking with the administration about what I witnessed today," he added. "What happens after that is up to them. But I hope, for your sake and for the sake of everyone who depends on this facility, that you find your way back to the person you were meant to be." With that, he turned and walked back to where Harry was sitting. The old man looked up at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with something like wonder. "You didn't have to do that," Harry said. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, taking the seat next to him. "I did." They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the normal sounds of the waiting room slowly resumed, though there was a different quality to them now. Something had shifted. Something had changed. "She's coming over here," Harry said quietly. Michael looked up. Sure enough, Denise was walking toward them. Her face was tear-streaked, her composure completely gone. She stopped in front of Harry's chair and, to the surprise of everyone watching, sank to her knees. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I said to you. It was cruel and wrong and inexcusable. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know how deeply I regret it." Harry looked at her for a long moment. In that look was 87 years of life, of pain and joy, of loss and love, of experiences that had shaped him into the man he was. And in that look was also something else, something that had sustained him through everything he had endured. Compassion. "Stand up, child," he said gently. "Come on now, stand up." Denise rose slowly, still trembling. Harry took her hand in his. "I forgive you," he said. She stared at him, disbelieving. "Just like that? After what I said?" "Just like that," Harry confirmed. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I've lived a long time. I've seen a lot of people do a lot of terrible things, and I've learned that most of them weren't terrible people. They were hurt people, broken people, people who had lost their way." He looked into her eyes with a kindness that made her want to weep all over again. "I don't know what happened to make you so angry," he said. "I don't know what kind of pain you're carrying, but I know it's there. I can see it, and I want you to know that whatever it is, it doesn't have to define you. You can choose differently. You can choose to be kind. It's never too late for that." Denise stood there, holding the hand of this old man she had so grievously wronged, and felt something crack open inside her. Something that had been frozen for years, something she had buried under layers of resentment and self-pity, began to thaw. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you." Harry patted her hand. "Now," he said with a small smile. "I don't suppose you could find out about that appointment for me. I really do need to take my medication." Despite everything, Denise laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the first one she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. "Yes," she said. "I'll take care of it right now, I promise." She hurried back to the nurse's station, her entire demeanor transformed. Within minutes, Harry was being called back for his appointment. As he rose to go, he turned to Michael. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did, for remembering." Michael stood and saluted. It was a crisp, perfect salute, the kind that came from decades of practice and genuine respect. "The honor is mine, Sergeant Mitchell." Harry returned the salute with a steadiness that seemed to defy his trembling hands. Then he walked toward the treatment area, his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. Michael watched him go, feeling a mixture of emotions that was hard to untangle. Pride, sadness, hope, the peculiar melancholy that comes from witnessing both the worst and best of human nature in the span of a few minutes. He was about to find a seat and wait for his own appointment when he noticed something. A young man, maybe 20 years old, was staring at him from across the waiting room. The young man was wearing civilian clothes, but there was something about his posture, his bearing, that suggested military. Michael nodded in acknowledgement. The young man hesitated, then walked over. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I just wanted to say that was incredible, what you did for that old guy." "His name is Sergeant Mitchell," Michael said, "and I didn't do it for him. I did it because it was right." The young man nodded slowly. "I'm shipping out next month," he said. "Army. I just enlisted." Michael looked at him more carefully, seeing the nervousness beneath the excitement, the fear beneath the courage. "What's your name, son?" "Private First Class David Chen, sir." I will be, after basic." Michael extended his hand. David shook it. The SEAL's grip was firm but not crushing, the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove. "Let me give you some advice," Michael said. "When you're in, you're going to meet people from all walks of life. Some of them will inspire you. Some of them will disappoint you. You'll see courage and cowardice, sometimes in the same person, sometimes in yourself. But the thing that will matter most, the thing that will define who you become, is how you treat people." He glanced toward the nurse's station, where Denise was now helping another patient with what appeared to be genuine attentiveness. "Not just the people above you, or the people who can help you," Michael continued, "but everybody, the clerk who processes your paperwork, the cook who makes your meals, the civilians you encounter, and especially, the veterans who came before you. They paved the road you're about to walk on. They paid prices you can't even imagine. Never forget that." David nodded solemnly. "I won't, sir. I promise." "Good," Michael said. "Now go call your mother. Tell her you love her. You're going to be too busy for a while, and she's going to worry about you no matter what you say, so you might as well give her something nice to hold on to." David smiled, a genuine youthful smile that reminded Michael of himself a lifetime ago. "Yes, sir. I'll do that." He walked away, already pulling out his phone. Michael watched him go, hoping that he would find his way through whatever lay ahead, that he would become the kind of soldier, the kind of man that the uniform deserved. An hour later, Michael's own appointment was finished. Nothing remarkable, just the usual tests and measurements and questions. He was in good health, all things considered. The years of hard service had taken their toll, but he had been fortunate. Many of his friends had not been. As he walked out of the examination room, he found an unexpected reception waiting for him. A small group had gathered in the hallway, staff members from various departments, a few patients, even a couple of administrators, and at the front of the group, standing with a posture that was almost at attention, was Denise. "Commander Sullivan," one of the administrators said, stepping forward, "we wanted to thank you for what you did today. Word has spread throughout the facility, and I think it's fair to say that you've reminded all of us of something important." Michael shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just said what needed to be said." "With respect, sir," Denise said, stepping forward, "you did much more than that." Her eyes were red but clear, and there was something different in her expression now, a humility that hadn't been there before. "You gave me a chance to see what I had become, and you gave me the opportunity to start making it right." She hesitated, then continued, "I've already spoken with the administration. I'm going to be taking some time off to deal with some personal issues. And when I come back, if I come back, I'm going to be different. I made a promise to Sergeant Mitchell, and I intend to keep it." Michael nodded slowly. "That takes courage," he said. "The courage to admit you were wrong and the courage to change. Not everyone can do that." "I'm going to try," Denise said. "That's all I can do." Michael looked at the group gathered around him. These were ordinary people dealing with the ordinary pressures of their jobs, their lives. They weren't heroes. They weren't soldiers. But they were, in their own way, fighting their own battles every day. "Let me tell you something," he said, addressing them all. "What happened today, the good and the bad, it's not unusual. It happens every day, in hospitals and offices and stores all over this country. People forget to see each other. They get caught up in their own problems, their own frustrations, and they forget that everyone else is fighting battles too." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The veterans who come through this facility," he continued, "they've given something that can never be repaid. Some of them gave years of their lives. Some of them gave their health, their peace of mind. Some of them gave everything. The least we can do, the absolute least, is treat them with the dignity and respect they deserve." "But here's the thing," Michael said, his voice softening. "It's not just about veterans, it's about everyone. That old woman in the waiting room who's scared about her diagnosis, that young father who's worried about how he's going to pay his medical bills, that child who doesn't understand why they're at the hospital again. Everyone deserves compassion. Everyone deserves kindness." He looked around at the assembled faces, seeing a mixture of emotions. Shame in some, hope in others, determination in a few. "You have the power to make someone's worst day a little bit better," Michael said. "You have the power to be the reason someone believes in humanity again. Don't waste that. Don't ever waste that." There was a long moment of silence. Then, one by one, the staff members began to applaud. Not a loud or boisterous applause, but something quieter, more meaningful, an acknowledgement of a truth they had needed to hear. Michael nodded to them, somewhat uncomfortable with the attention. He was a man who was used to operating in the shadows, to doing what needed to be done without seeking recognition or praise. This was not his natural environment. He made his way through the group, accepting handshakes and thank yous with characteristic grace, and finally emerged into the main lobby of the hospital. The November sky outside was still grey, but there seemed to be a bit more light in it now. Or maybe that was just his imagination. He was about to head for the exit when he heard a familiar voice, "Commander Sullivan." Michael turned. Harry Mitchell was walking toward him, a small bandage on his arm, where they had drawn blood, but otherwise looking remarkably good for a man of his age. His eyes, Michael noticed, had a brightness to them that hadn't been there before. "Sergeant Mitchell," Michael said, "I hope everything checked out okay." "Clean bill of health," Harry said. "Well, as clean as you can get at my age. Doctor says I'm in remarkably good shape for someone who's been shot 3 times. Both men smiled at the dark humor that only those who have faced mortality can truly appreciate. "I was hoping I'd catch you before you left," Harry said. "I wanted to give you something." He reached into the pocket of his worn army jacket and produced a small, weathered photograph. He held it out to Michael, who took it carefully, aware that he was handling something precious. The photograph showed a group of young soldiers, 10 of them, standing in front of what appeared to be a bombed-out building. They were smiling despite their obvious exhaustion, their uniforms dirty and torn, their faces marked by experiences that no young men should ever have to endure. In the center of the group, barely recognizable but unmistakable if you knew where to look, was a young Harry Mitchell. "That's the squad," Harry said. "That was taken in Belgium about a week before the ambush. Those are the men I was trying to save that day." Michael studied the faces in the photograph, trying to imagine what they had gone through, what they had seen, what they had felt in those terrible, heroic hours. 8 of them made it, Harry said quietly. 8 out of 10. 2 didn't survive their wounds, but the other 8 went home. They got married, they had children, they had grandchildren, they had lives. His voice trembled slightly, but he pressed on. "I've carried that photograph with me every day for 80 years, Harry said. "It reminds me of why I did what I did. It reminds me that it was worth it. But I think maybe it's time for me to pass it on." Michael looked up sharply. "Sir, I can't accept this. This is yours." Harry shook his head. "It was mine. Now I want it to be yours. You did something today that meant more to me than I can express. You reminded me that my service mattered, that those men, those boys, they're not forgotten, and I want you to have something that reminds you of the same thing." He took Michael's hand and closed it around the photograph. "When you look at this," Harry said, "I want you to remember something. It wasn't the medals that mattered. It wasn't the recognition or the parades or any of that. What mattered was the men standing next to me. What mattered was being there for them when they needed someone. That's what service is, Commander. It's not about being a hero. It's about being there." Michael felt something burning in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He blinked it away, but not before Harry noticed. "You're a good man, Commander Sullivan," Harry said. "Don't ever let anyone tell you different, and don't ever stop doing what you did today. There are a lot of people out there who need someone like you to remind them that they matter." Michael nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was rougher than usual. "I'll treasure this, sir," he said, "and I'll try to live up to it." "That's all any of us can do," Harry said. "Try." They stood there for a moment longer, 2 men separated by decades but united by something deeper, the bond of service. The understanding that comes from having dedicated your life to something larger than yourself. The knowledge that no matter what the world might say, what they had done, what they had given, had meaning. "You need a ride home?" Michael asked. "I've got my truck in the parking lot," Harry smiled. "That would be nice. It's a long bus ride back to my place, and these old knees aren't what they used to be." They walked out of the hospital together, the old soldier and the retired SEAL, into the grey November afternoon. The world outside looked the same as it had that morning, but something had changed, something important. As they drove through the streets of the city, Harry told stories. Stories from the war, stories from the decades of peacetime that followed. He talked about Margaret, his wife, and the 62 years of happiness they had shared. He talked about his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. He talked about the friends he had lost and the friends who were still with him. Michael listened, mostly in silence, asking the occasional question. He understood that this was what Harry needed, perhaps even more than the medical care he had come to the hospital to receive. He needed someone to listen. He needed someone to remember. When they arrived at Harry's house, a small but well-maintained home in a quiet neighborhood, Michael helped him out of the truck and walked him to the door. "Thank you," Harry said, "for everything." "No, sir," Michael replied. "Thank you for your service, for your stories, for the reminder." "What reminder?" Harry asked. Michael thought for a moment. "The reminder that it's always worth it. Standing up for what's right, treating people with dignity, fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. It's always worth it. Harry smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. You're going to be just fine, Commander Sullivan. I can tell. He patted Michael on the shoulder and went inside. Michael stood on the porch for a moment longer, the photograph still in his hand. He looked at the faces of those young soldiers, frozen in time, their stories now a part of his own story. Then he walked back to his truck and drove away, carrying with him the weight and the privilege of their legacy. The story of what happened at Walter Reed that day spread, as such stories do. It was shared in break rooms and waiting rooms, passed along in whispered conversations and social media posts. Some of the details changed in the retelling, as they always do, but the core of the story remained the same. A nurse had forgotten the most fundamental principle of her profession, the duty of compassion. An old soldier had been wounded by words in a way that no bullet had ever managed, and a stranger had stepped in, not with violence or threats, but with truth and dignity, and had changed the course of at least 2 lives. Denise took a 6-week leave of absence. During that time, she sought therapy for the depression and anger that had been consuming her for years. She reconnected with her children, painful and awkward as those conversations were. She began the long process of rebuilding herself into the person she had always wanted to be. When she returned to work, she was different. Not perfect, nobody is, but different. She made it a point to learn about every veteran she treated. She listened to their stories. She treated them with the respect and kindness they deserved. And when she found herself slipping, when the old bitterness threatened to creep back in, she remembered that morning. She remembered the old man's forgiveness. She remembered the commander's words. It's never too late to choose kindness. Harry lived for another 3 years after that day. They were good years, better than the ones that had come before. Michael visited him regularly, bringing groceries, helping with yard work, simply sitting and talking. The friendship that had formed in that hospital waiting room deepened into something profound, a bond between 2 men who had served their country in different eras but shared the same fundamental values. When Harry passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 90, Michael was there within hours. He helped with the funeral arrangements, delivered the eulogy, and made sure that every veteran in the area knew to attend. The church was standing room only, filled with men and women in uniform, young and old, all there to pay their respects to a true American hero. Michael kept the photograph. He framed it and hung it in his study, where he could see it every day. When people asked about it, he told them the story, not just the story of what Harry did in Belgium, but the story of what happened in the hospital waiting room, the story of forgiveness, the story of standing up, the story of how one moment can change everything. The story doesn't end there, of course. Stories like this never really end. They echo through time, touching lives in ways that can never be fully traced or measured. David Chen, the young soldier who had witnessed the confrontation, went on to have a distinguished military career. He served 2 tours overseas and earned several commendations for his leadership and his compassion toward both his fellow soldiers and the civilians they encountered. He often told people that his approach to service had been shaped by something he witnessed in a hospital waiting room before he even finished basic training. Other staff members at the hospital, inspired by what they had seen, made changes in their own behavior, small changes mostly. Being a little more patient with difficult patients, taking an extra moment to learn someone's story, treating each person who walked through the doors as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. These changes rippled outward, affecting other staff members, other patients, other lives, and Michael Sullivan continued to live by the principles that had guided his entire adult life. He volunteered at veterans organizations. He mentored young service members transitioning to civilian life. He spoke at schools and community groups about the meaning of service and the importance of treating every person with respect. When people thanked him for his service, he always said the same thing: "Don't thank me. Just be kind to someone today. Pay it forward." Years later, Michael was invited to speak at a ceremony honoring veterans at the very hospital where he had first met Harry. The facility had undergone renovations since then, modernized and expanded to better serve the growing population of veterans who depended on it. But some things hadn't changed. The fluorescent lights still hummed, the waiting room chairs were still uncomfortable, and the lessons that had been learned that November day were still being practiced. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of veterans, staff members, and community leaders. He saw faces young and old, bodies broken and whole, eyes that had seen too much and eyes that still held hope. He saw, in the front row, an older woman with grey hair and kind eyes. Denise. She had never left the hospital, had worked her way up to a supervisory position, and was now known throughout the facility as someone who truly embodied the spirit of service to veterans. Their eyes met, and she nodded. A small gesture, but it carried the weight of all those years, all that growth, all that redemption. Michael cleared his throat and began to speak. "I want to tell you a story," he said. "It's a story about an old soldier, a nurse having the worst day of her life and a moment that changed everything. But really, it's a story about what it means to serve, what it means to honor those who have served, and what it means to be human." The room fell silent, and Michael told the story. He told it with all the detail he could remember, all the emotion he could convey. He told them about Harry's courage in Belgium and his quiet dignity in the hospital. He told them about Denise's cruelty and her redemption. He told them about the photograph that still hung in his study and the men whose faces would never age, frozen forever in that moment of brotherhood and sacrifice. And when he was finished, when the last words had left his lips and the room was thick with emotion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. "This is who we do it for," he said, holding it up for all to see. "Not for ourselves, not for glory or recognition, but for the men and women who stand beside us, for the families who wait at home, for the future we're trying to protect. This is why we serve. This is why we sacrifice. This is why we never, ever stop caring about each other." He looked out at the crowd, his voice strong despite the decades of wear. "I want to leave you with something Sergeant Mitchell told me once. He said, it wasn't the medals that mattered. It wasn't the recognition or the parades. What mattered was the men standing next to me. What mattered was being there for them when they needed someone. That's what service is. It's not about being a hero. It's about being there." Michael paused, letting the words sink in. "Be there for each other," he said. "That's all I ask, in the big moments and the small ones, in the easy times and the hard ones. Be there. That's how we honor those who came before us. That's how we protect those who come after. That's how we become worthy of the sacrifice that has been made on our behalf." He stepped back from the podium. The room erupted in applause, standing, thunderous, going on for what seemed like hours. Michael stood there, accepting it with the same quiet grace he had shown that day in the hospital waiting room, thinking of Harry, thinking of the photograph, thinking of all the stories that would never be told, all the heroes who would never be recognized. And then, as the applause finally died down and people began to file out, Michael made his way through the crowd. He accepted handshakes and hugs, answered questions and shared stories, playing his part in the endless chain of memory and honor that connects one generation of warriors to the next. At the end of the night, when the venue was almost empty and the clean-up crews were beginning their work, Michael found himself standing alone in the corner of the room. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from pouring out emotion rather than physical exertion. But it was a good tired. a satisfied, tired. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Denise standing there. She looked older than she had that day in the hospital, of course, but there was something youthful in her eyes, a lightness that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For giving me the chance to become who I was supposed to be, for not giving up on me when you had every right to, for believing that I could be better." Michael shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You did the work. You made the choices. You became this person. I just said some words." Denise smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes, the right words at the right time from the right person. You were that person for me, and I've spent the last 20 years trying to be that person for others. Have you succeeded? Sometimes. Not always, but I keep trying. That's what Sergeant Mitchell taught me. You just keep trying." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had been thrown together by circumstance and had both been changed by it. The universe works that way sometimes, bringing people together at exactly the moment they need each other, even if they don't realize it at the time. "You know what I remember most about that day?" Denise said eventually. "What's that?" "The way he forgave me. No hesitation, no conditions. Just pure, unconditional forgiveness. I've thought about that moment every day since. I've tried to understand how someone could do that, especially after what I said to him." Michael nodded. That's who he was. That's what his generation was made of. They had seen the worst of humanity, and they chose to believe in the best. They had every reason to be bitter and angry, and they chose to be kind. It's a lesson most of us still haven't learned. "I'm trying to learn it," Denise said. "Every day. That's all any of us can do." Michael looked at his watch. It was late, later than he had realized. The night had gotten away from him, as nights often did when memories were involved. "I should go," he said. "It's past my bedtime." Denise laughed. "Mine too. But Commander, before you go, I want you to know something. Because of what happened that day, because of what you did, and what Sergeant Mitchell taught me, I've trained every nurse who's come through this facility for the past 15 years. I tell them his story. I tell them your story. I make them understand what it means to serve those who have served us." She met his eyes directly. "There are hundreds of nurses out there, scattered across the country, who treat veterans with dignity and respect because of what happened in that waiting room. Thousands of patients who have been treated better because of the ripple effect of that moment. You can't measure the impact, but it's there. It's real." Michael felt that burning in his eyes again, that telltale sign of emotion that he had learned to control, but never to eliminate entirely. He blinked it away, as he always did. "Harry would be glad to know that," he said. He always hoped his story would help people. "It has," Denise assured him. "It does, and it will continue to long after all of us are gone." They shook hands, a firm and meaningful gesture, and then Denise walked away to finish her duties. Michael watched her go, thinking about how much she had changed, how much they had all changed, how much the world kept changing around them, even as certain fundamental truths remained constant. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The November sky was clear now, filled with stars that had watched over humanity since long before there were hospitals or soldiers or wars to fight. Michael stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, feeling the weight of the years and the lightness of purpose. He thought about Harry, about the photograph, about the men in that picture whose faces he had come to know as well as his own. He thought about Denise, about David Chen, about all the people whose lives had been touched by that single moment in a hospital waiting room. He thought about the strange and beautiful way that the universe connected people, wove their stories together, made meaning out of what often seemed like chaos. And he thought about what it meant to serve. Not just in the military sense, though that was certainly part of it, but in the larger sense, the sense of being there for others, the sense of standing up when standing up was hard. The sense of treating every person you met as worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or what they had done. That was Harry's legacy. That was what he had tried to teach Michael in those last 3 years, through his stories and his example and his unwavering kindness. The medals and the citations and the history books, those were all fine things. But the real legacy was in how you treated people. In the small acts of compassion that no one would ever record, but that made all the difference in the world. Michael got into his truck and drove home through the quiet streets. The city was asleep for the most part, just a few scattered lights in windows, a few lonely souls out walking in the darkness. He wondered about each of them, about their stories, about the battles they were fighting that no one else could see. When he got home, he went straight to his study. He stood in front of the photograph for a long time, looking at those young faces, those boys who had become men in the crucible of war and had emerged somehow still believing in the good. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." The faces in the photograph didn't answer, of course. They never did. But Michael liked to think that somewhere, in whatever came after this life, Harry Mitchell was smiling. He liked to think that the men in the photograph, the ones who had made it and the ones who hadn't, were together again. He liked to think that they knew their sacrifice had not been forgotten, that their legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had never met them, but who had been changed by their story. He turned off the light and went to bed. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more people to help, more moments when he would have the opportunity to make a difference. That was the nature of service. It never ended. It just kept going, day after day, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of care and sacrifice and hope. And Michael Sullivan, Commander, United States Navy, retired, was proud to be a part of it. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. In the years that followed, the story of Sergeant Harry Mitchell and Commander Michael Sullivan became something of a legend in certain circles. Not a famous legend, not the kind that gets made into movies or written about in best-selling books, but a quiet legend, the kind that gets passed down from person to person, told in hushed voices in veterans' halls and hospital break rooms, shared between generations of service members who understand what it means. The story changed, of course, as all stories do in the telling. Some versions added details that weren't there, while others left out things that were. Some versions made Michael into more of a hero than he was, while others focused more on Harry's forgiveness or Denise's redemption. But the core of the story, the heart of it, remained the same. Stand up for those who need it. Treat everyone with dignity. Forgive when forgiveness is warranted. Be there for each other. Simple lessons, really. The kind that most people learn as children and then spend their whole lives trying to put into practice. The kind that sound easy until you're faced with a situation where they're hard, where it would be easier to look away, to stay quiet, to let someone else deal with it. Michael thought about those lessons every day. He thought about them when he volunteered at the VA, helping veterans navigate the often Byzantine bureaucracy of benefits and services. He thought about them when he spoke to young service members, trying to prepare them for both the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. He thought about them when he looked in the mirror each morning, reminding himself of who he wanted to be and recommitting himself to the effort. He wasn't perfect. Nobody is. There were days when he was tired, when he was frustrated, when he said things he wished he could take back. There were moments when he fell short of his own standards, when the weight of everything he had experienced threatened to pull him down. But he kept trying. That was the important thing. He kept trying. One evening, about 5 years after Harry's death, Michael received a phone call. It was from a young man named James Mitchell, Harry's great-grandson. James was 21 years old and had just enlisted in the army, continuing a family tradition that stretched back generations. "I found your number in my great-grandfather's things," James said. He had it written down with a note that said, "If you ever need guidance, call this man." Michael smiled, surprised and touched in equal measure. "Your great-grandfather was a remarkable person." "I know," James said, "but I never got to know him as well as I would have liked. He died when I was 16. I was hoping maybe you could tell me about him. About the real him, not just the stories in the history books." Michael looked at the photograph on his wall, at the young Harry Mitchell frozen in time, and at all the experiences that lay between that moment and the old man he had known. "I would be honored," he said. They met for coffee the next week, at a diner not far from where Harry had lived. James was a handsome young man, with his great-grandfather's eyes, and something of his bearing. He was nervous, Michael could tell, the way young people often are when they're about to embark on something that will change their lives forever. They talked for hours. Michael told James about the day in the hospital, about the years of friendship that followed, about the lessons Harry had taught him through words and example. He told him about the photograph, about the men in it, about what their sacrifice meant and why it was important to remember. And James, in turn, told Michael about growing up with Harry as a distant but beloved figure. About the stories his parents had told him, the medals that sat in a display case in the family home, the sense of legacy that had driven him to enlist, even when his parents had urged him to choose a safer path. "He would be proud of you," Michael said finally. "Not because you're joining the military, although he would appreciate that, but because you're trying to understand, you're trying to carry on what he believed in." James nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "That's all I want. To be worthy of his name, to make him proud." "Then remember what I told you," Michael said. "The medals don't matter. The recognition doesn't matter. What matters is how you treat the people around you. What matters is being there when someone needs you. What matters is having the courage to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when nobody's watching, even when it costs you something." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Your great-grandfather held a position for 7 hours against impossible odds. That was extraordinary. But I'll tell you what was even more extraordinary. When that nurse said terrible things to him, things that would have justified anger, resentment, bitterness, he forgave her, immediately and completely. He saw past her cruelty to the pain underneath, and he chose compassion over vengeance." Michael sat back. That's the kind of man he was. That's the legacy he left behind. And that's what I hope you'll carry with you, whatever the future holds. James was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. He held it out to Michael. It was a challenge coin, the kind that military units create to commemorate shared experiences and foster esprit de corps. But this one was special. This one had been created specifically for James's unit, with the Mitchell family name and the dates of Harry's service engraved on one side. "We had these made," James said, "for everyone in my unit. I wanted them to know about my great-grandfather. I wanted his story to inspire them the way it inspires me." He pressed the coin into Michael's hand. "I want you to have this one," he said. "You were his friend. You were part of his story. It's only right." Michael looked at the coin, turning it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, the meaning of it. This was what Harry had wanted, he realized. This was the legacy he had hoped to leave behind. Not monuments or statues, but stories passed down, lessons carried forward, young people inspired to be better than they might otherwise have been. "Thank you," Michael said. "I'll treasure this." They parted ways that evening with a handshake and a promise to stay in touch. And they did stay in touch over the years that followed. Michael watched from a distance as James completed his training, deployed overseas, faced the challenges and uncertainties that came with military service. He offered advice when asked, encouragement when needed, and always, always, the reminder of what Harry had taught them both. James came back from his deployments changed, as all soldiers do. He had seen things, done things, experienced things that would stay with him forever. Some of those things were good, some were not. But through it all, he tried to hold on to the lessons his great-grandfather had taught him, the principles that Michael had reinforced. Be there for people. Treat everyone with dignity. Have the courage to do what's right. Years passed. Michael grew older, his body slowing down even as his mind stayed sharp. He continued to volunteer, to mentor, to tell stories about Harry and the men in the photograph. He watched as new generations of soldiers came and went, as wars began and ended, as the world changed in ways he could never have predicted. And through it all, the story endured. The story of an old soldier, a nurse, and a moment in a hospital waiting room that had changed everything. It was told and retold, passed from person to person, evolving but never losing its core. It became part of the larger story of what it means to serve, what it means to sacrifice, what it means to treat every person as worthy of respect. On the last day of Michael's life, 40 years after that morning at Walter Reed, he was sitting in his study, looking at the photograph. James was there, a middle-aged man now with children of his own, children who had heard the story of their great-great-grandfather so many times they could recite it from memory. "It was a good life," Michael said, his voice weak but clear. "I have no regrets." James held his hand. "You've done more good than you know. You've touched more lives than you can count." Michael smiled. "I just did what Harry taught me. I was there." Those were his last words. He died peacefully that evening, surrounded by friends and family, his legacy secure. At his funeral, James gave the eulogy. He told the story of that day at Walter Reed, the story that had shaped his own life and the lives of so many others. He talked about what Michael had taught him, what Harry had taught them both, what the long chain of service and sacrifice meant to him personally. And at the end, he said something that would have made both old warriors proud. "The true measure of a life is not in the medals on your chest or the titles after your name. It's in the moments when you had a choice between what was easy and what was right, and you chose right. It's in the times when you saw someone who needed help and you helped them, even when it cost you something. It's in the way you treated people every day, in the big moments and the small ones." He looked out at the crowd, at the veterans and civilians, the young and the old, all gathered to honor a man who had never sought honor for himself. Commander Michael Sullivan understood that. Sergeant Harry Mitchell understood that. And I hope when my time comes, people will say that I understood it too. That's the only legacy worth leaving. That's the only medal worth earning. That's what it means to truly serve. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. Life went on, as it always does, but the story remained. It's still out there, still being told, still inspiring people to be a little bit kinder, a little bit braver, a little bit more willing to stand up for what's right. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Harry Mitchell and Michael Sullivan are together again. They're sitting on a porch somewhere, looking out at a sunset that never ends, talking about the old days and the new days and all the days yet to come. They're at peace. They've earned it. And their legacy lives on, in every person who hears their story and is moved to be a little bit better, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more worthy of the sacrifice that was made on their behalf. That's how heroes are remembered, not in statues or monuments, but in the hearts of those they touched, in the lives they changed, in the chain of service and sacrifice that connects one generation to the next. That's the story of what happened that November morning at Walter Reed Military Medical Center. The story of an old soldier, a nurse, and a moment that changed everything. And now you know it too. What you do with it is up to you. The memory of that day continues to resonate through the years like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction, touching shores that can never be fully mapped or measured. In military academies and nursing schools, in break rooms and waiting rooms, in quiet conversations between strangers who find themselves sharing stories, the tale of Sergeant Harry Mitchell and Commander Michael Sullivan lives on. There's a plaque now at Walter Reed, installed years after the events of that November morning. It doesn't tell the whole story, plaques rarely do, but it captures something of the essence. It reads, "In honor of Sergeant Harold Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient, and all veterans who have served with courage and dignity. May we always treat those who have served with the respect they deserve. May we always have the courage to stand up for what is right." People pause in front of it sometimes, read the words and move on. Most of them don't know the full story behind it, but some do. And those who do often find themselves standing there a little longer, thinking about what it means, what it asks of them, how they might live up to the standard it sets. The hospital itself has changed, of course. Buildings have been renovated, technology has advanced, staff has turned over countless times, but there's something in the culture of the place that traces back to that day, an expectation of respect. A commitment to treating every patient, regardless of age or rank or circumstances, as a human being worthy of dignity. Denise would be proud to see it. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 10 years after Michael, having spent the last decades of her life living out the transformation that had begun in that waiting room. Her obituary described her as a champion for veteran care and a mentor to countless nurses. And it didn't mention the worst moment of her life, but it celebrated the best of what she had become afterward. Her children spoke at her funeral. They talked about a mother they hadn't always understood, whose bitterness had once threatened to destroy their family. They talked about watching her change, slowly at first and then more dramatically. They talked about learning from her example that it's never too late to become a better person. Never too late to choose compassion over cruelty. The lessons continued to spread, as lessons do, passed from person to person in ways that can never be fully traced. A nurse who had trained under Denise moved to another state and brought those principles with her. A patient who had witnessed the original confrontation told his family about it, and they told their friends, and the story kept moving. James Mitchell, Harry's great-grandson, eventually retired from the military with the rank of colonel. He had served with distinction in multiple conflicts, earned commendations for his leadership and his character, but when people asked him about his career, he always talked about his great-grandfather first. Always told the story of what Harry had done in Belgium and what Harry had done in that hospital waiting room, and why the second act of courage was, in many ways, greater than the first. His own children grew up hearing those stories. Some of them entered military service, carrying on the family tradition. Others chose different paths, but they all carried with them the lessons their father had taught them, the lessons that had been passed down through generations. The fundamental truth that how you treat people matters more than any achievement or accolade. One of James's daughters, a woman named Sarah, became a social worker. She specialized in working with elderly veterans, helping them navigate the challenges of aging, connecting them with services and support. She often visited nursing homes and assisted living facilities, spending time with veterans who had no one else to visit them. She told them the story of her great-great-grandfather. She told them about Commander Michael Sullivan and what he had done. She reminded them that their service mattered, that they were not forgotten, that there were people who cared about them and were grateful for their sacrifice. It was small work in a way, not the kind that makes headlines or wins awards. But Sarah understood something that her great-great-grandfather had known, that Michael Sullivan had known, that all true servants understand. The small work is often the most important work. The quiet moments of compassion are often the ones that matter most. One day, Sarah was visiting a veteran named Thomas, a Korean War veteran who had been living in the same nursing home for 15 years. Thomas was 93 years old, frail and often confused, but he had lucid moments when his eyes would clear and his mind would sharpen, and in those moments he would tell stories of his service that left Sarah in awe. On this particular day, Thomas was having a good day. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes bright, and when Sarah came in, he smiled with recognition. "There's my girl," he said. "Come to hear more of my war stories?" "Always," Sarah said, pulling up a chair. "But today I want to tell you one." She told him the story of Harry Mitchell and Michael Sullivan. She told him about the waiting room, the nurse, the confrontation, the forgiveness. She told him about the ripples that had spread out from that moment, the lives that had been touched, the changes that had been made. Thomas listened in silence, his old eyes growing wet. When she finished, he reached out and took her hand. "That's a good story," he said. "That's a real good story. It's your story too," Sarah said. "You're part of that chain. Your service, your sacrifice, it all matters, it all connects." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been feeling like nobody remembers," he admitted. "Like all of it was for nothing, like I'm just waiting to die and nobody cares." "People care," Sarah said firmly. "I care, and there are thousands of people out there who care, even if you'll never meet them. Your service created the world they're living in. Your sacrifice protected the freedom they enjoy. That means something. That will always mean something." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for reminding me." They sat together for a while longer, not saying much, just two people connected by a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back through generations. And when Sarah finally left, Thomas was sitting up a little straighter, his eyes a little brighter, his heart a little lighter. That's what the story does, that's what it's for. Not to glorify war or celebrate violence, but to remind us of the human connections that make sacrifice meaningful. To remind us that every veteran, no matter how old or forgotten they may seem, carries within them a story of courage that deserves to be honored. To remind us that how we treat each other in the big moments and the small ones is the true measure of our character. The world keeps spinning. New wars begin and old ones end. Young people put on uniforms and raise their hands to swear oaths that will bind them to service. Old soldiers pass away, taking their stories with them, leaving behind only the ripples they created in the lives of those who knew them. But some stories refuse to die. Some moments are so charged with meaning that they transcend the people involved, becoming something larger, something that belongs to everyone. The story of what happened that November morning at Walter Reed is one of those stories. It's a story about standing up, about treating people with dignity, about the courage to confront cruelty and the even greater courage to forgive it, about the bonds that connect those who have served across generations and across the divides of rank and time and experience. It's a story that asks a question, not explicitly, but implicitly in every word and every moment. The question is simple. What will you do? When you see someone being treated with cruelty, will you look away or will you stand up? When you have the chance to show compassion, will you take it or will you let the moment pass? When you encounter someone who has given of themselves in service to others, will you honor that service or will you dismiss it? These are the questions that Harry Mitchell and Michael Sullivan answered with their actions. These are the questions that Denise answered when she chose to change her life. These are the questions that James and Sarah and countless others have answered in the years since that November morning. And now the question comes to you. The story is told. The lesson is offered. The choice is yours. What will you do? In a world that often seems dark and divided, in a time when cruelty and indifference can feel overwhelming, it's easy to believe that one person can't make a difference. It's easy to retreat into cynicism, to protect yourself from disappointment by expecting the worst from people. But the story of what happened at Walter Reed reminds us that this isn't true. One person can make a difference. One moment can change everything. One act of courage, one gesture of compassion, one decision to stand up instead of looking away, can send ripples out into the world that touch lives in ways that can never be fully measured. Harry Mitchell understood this. He lived it in the frozen forests of Belgium and in the waiting room of a military hospital 8 decades later. His life was a testament to the power of individual courage, individual compassion, individual choice. Michael Sullivan understood this. He took the lesson he learned from Harry and carried it forward, teaching it to others, living it every day until his last breath. His life was a bridge between generations, a link in the chain of service and sacrifice that connects the past to the future. Denise understood this eventually. She learned it the hard way, through shame and regret and the long work of redemption. But she learned it. And in learning it, she became living proof that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose a different path. Now you understand it too. You've heard the story. You've felt its weight. You carry it with you now, whether you wanted to or not. The question is what you'll do with it. Will you let it fade, like so many stories, into the background noise of a busy life? Will you nod and acknowledge its truth and then go on as before? Or will you let it change you, even a little? Will you carry it with you into your daily life, letting it inform how you treat the people you encounter, how you respond to cruelty and compassion, how you make the countless small choices that, together, define who you are? That's the real ending of this story. Not the words on the page, but what happens after. Not what Harry did or Michael did or Denise did, but what you do, tomorrow and the day after and all the days that follow. The chain of service and sacrifice continues. It stretches back through all of human history and forward into a future we can't imagine. And you're part of it, whether you realize it or not. Everything you do, every choice you make, every moment of courage or cowardice, compassion or cruelty adds another link to that chain. Make it a good one. Honor those who came before you by being worthy of their sacrifice. Protect those who come after you by leaving them a world that's a little bit better than you found it. And always, always remember what Harry Mitchell taught us all. It's not about the medals, it's not about the recognition, it's about being there for the people who need you. It's about being there. That is the true meaning of service. That is the true measure of a life. That is the legacy that Harry Mitchell left behind and Michael Sullivan carried forward and now rests in your hands. What will you do with it? The morning after Michael Sullivan's funeral, James Mitchell woke up early. He couldn't sleep, hadn't been able to sleep properly for weeks. Too many memories, too many emotions, too much weight pressing down on him. He got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his wife, and walked through the silent house to his study. The room was filled with mementos of his military career, plaques and photographs and challenge coins. But his eyes went immediately to the place of honor, the spot on his desk where 2 items sat side by side. The first was the photograph that Harry had given to Michael, and that Michael had, in turn, passed on to James in the last weeks of his life. The young soldiers in the picture seemed to look out at him, their eyes full of a knowledge that transcended time. The second was the challenge coin that James had given to Michael all those years ago, returned to him now along with the photograph. It had been with Michael when he died, clutched in his hand, and the hospice nurse had made sure to give it back to the family. James picked up both items, holding them carefully, feeling the weight of all they represented. 2 small objects carrying the hopes and sacrifices of generations. He thought about his great-grandfather, the man he had never really known, but whose shadow had shaped his entire life. He thought about Michael, the mentor and friend who had become a second grandfather to him, who had taught him what Harry's legacy really meant. He thought about his own children and their children and all the generations yet to come. What would they make of these objects? What stories would they tell about the men who had carried them? There was a soft knock at the door. James looked up to see his granddaughter, Emma, standing in the doorway. She was 12 years old, all gangly limbs and curious eyes, and she had always had an uncanny ability to sense when someone in the family needed company. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. James smiled and gestured for her to come in. "Something like that." Emma walked over and looked at the objects in his hands. "Is that the picture?" she asked. "The one from the war?" "It is." "And the coin? Is that the one you gave to Commander Sullivan?" "It is." Emma was quiet for a moment, studying both items with the intense focus that only children seem capable of. Then she looked up at her grandfather. "Will you tell me the story again?" she asked. James felt something shift in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced when he first met Michael Sullivan, when he first truly understood what his great-grandfather's legacy meant. It was the feeling of a chain being extended, of a torch being passed, of something precious being entrusted to the next generation. "Of course," he said. "Come sit with me." Emma curled up in the chair beside him, and James began to speak. He told her about Harry, about the war, about the waiting room at Walter Reed. He told her about Michael and Denise and the transformation that had followed. He told her about the ripples that had spread out from that moment, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured. And as he spoke, he saw something kindle in Emma's eyes. Understanding, maybe, or inspiration, or the first stirrings of a commitment that would shape her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. When he finished, Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that had been asked by every generation since that November morning. "What happens now?" James looked at her, at this child who carried within her the blood and the legacy of heroes. He thought about all the people who had been changed by this story, all the lives that had been touched, all the ripples that were still spreading out into the world. "Now," he said, "we carry it forward, we tell the story, we live the lessons, we try every day to be worthy of what they gave us." He held up the photograph, showing her the faces of those young soldiers. "These men sacrificed everything so that we could live in freedom. Michael spent his whole life honoring that sacrifice and teaching others to do the same. And now, it's our turn." He put his hand on her shoulder. "It's not always easy," he said. "There will be times when it's hard to do the right thing, when it would be easier to look away, to stay quiet, to let someone else handle it. But that's when it matters most. That's when you have to remember this story and ask yourself what Harry would do, what Michael would do." Emma nodded slowly, her young face serious, with understanding that seemed beyond her years. "I'll remember, Grandpa," she said. "I promise." James pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. "I know you will, sweetheart. I know you will." They sat together in the early morning light, grandfather and granddaughter, connected by a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back through generations and forward into a future they could only imagine. The photographs sat on the desk between them, the faces of those young soldiers watching over them, their sacrifice and their hope alive in this moment and in all the moments yet to come. Outside, the sun was rising on a new day. A day full of choices, full of opportunities to stand up or look away, to show compassion or indifference, to add another link to the chain of human connection and service. The story continues. It always does, and now it's yours to carry forward.